fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're with Sudip Bhattacharya, who is an activist, a writer, a Ph.D. candidate at Rutgers, and general all-around thinker on solidarity, activism, and the left. Now, I have to admit, Sudip, that when most people say the word activism, that there is a part of me that wants to reach for the safety catch on my revolver. I think that is an unfortunate legacy of some of the problems that you actually directly address in your writing. So let's just start off here, though. We're going to define our terms for once. What do you mean when you say activist? It's a word that's used by so many different kinds of people for so many different kinds of things that it's like saying, well, organizer's another one now, but it's like saying expert. I don't always know what it means. So what do you mean when you say activist?
First of all, thanks for having me on the show. Been watching your show for a while now. The reason why I said myself as being activist is just because, like you just said, I think a lot of people do say organizer a lot when they maybe mean activist. And it's actually my attempt at being a little humble as to just saying, I have done organizing in the past, but currently I'm more in the support role. And so that's how I view activism, at least the way I'm thinking about it. And that's why I chose to identify as such. So that's really the reason why I said activist other than organizer, because I think there's a habit for people just to say the opposite when they actually just mean someone who might be in a support role.
Okay. So I think let's talk about organizing for a second, because that's a word that, that's become a loaded term that I see thrown around.
Yeah.
One thing that I have noticed, and this is not to knock our friends in the DSA or anything like that, but when I sit and talk to, say, a DSA labor committee, locally or whatever, which I used to do back before COVID, I would notice that most of the people I was talking to, they were real organizers, but if they were in unions, they were on the professional organizer lens side of things. They worked for the union. They were not organizing the union in a workplace. I can at least think of 3 instances where that happened. Now, as a person who is an AR, so an association representative, we have complicated relationships actually with people on. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to use a little bit of union talk on the Uniserve side of things, and I think that relationship's also not really understood by a lot of leftists who throw out the term organizer a lot, because I'm like, are you salting for a union? Are you trying to organize your own workplace? Are you operating in a support role? Are you working for the union in a professional or semi-professional capacity? Those are all different things, right? But I think, and unfortunately, I think this is because the general lack of unionization in a lot of sectors in the U.S. economy, a lot of people are unfamiliar with this. And actually, some people even who are technically in a union, but because they're not reps, are not super active, they just pay their dues, they also aren't really familiar with this. So how do you think this understanding has affected the understanding of what organizer is. Like if we look at these different roles, because I would actually consider 3 out of 4 of those roles I just mentioned, they're all kinds of organizers, but they're in some ways radically different in what they do and what their interests are.
Yeah, so interestingly, at our chapter, Central New Jersey DSA, we've had similar conversations about this actually around the time when COVID hit. Obviously, we had these conversations because COVID was a disaster, still is a rolling disaster, and obviously just threw everybody for a loop. And so we really had to sit down, or some of us had to sit down and really think through what the plan is, and that includes what exactly these roles are. So I remember back in the day, we discussed Jane McElvee's book. I think she talks about mobilizing, activism, and then organizing. And it became very clear that a lot of us, including myself, weren't entirely sure what those meant. When I think of organizer, I do think of certain people in our chapter, frankly, who bring people together for both short-term and long-term goals, and who have a mission in mind in terms of where they want people to be. And I've seen that in our chapter. And again, I'm just trying to be like, I've done a little bit of that. I was the co-chair of the chapter for a little bit, but recently I've been more of a support role. And that's why, to me, I don't do that. So hence I'm not an organizer. I just do the support role. But I've seen that in person in our chapter. And for me, even that has been more clarified because of the pandemic, seeing who's actually in the support role and who's actually trying to bring together people for specific, but also long-term goals in mind. And that's where, I think that's where some of our chapter members are at right now, thinking about it.
So I guess what I want to pull out from that, I think is an interesting thing. When we say support role, we are not trying to imply, or you're not trying to imply, but I also wouldn't be trying to imply that they aren't vital to what's being done.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think some people might bristle because, they might hear, well, I'm really helping, the work I do is important. And the answer to that is, yeah, it is actually. Yeah. It's very important. But and I think this gets to, I've noticed you both, I've followed you for a while on the socials. I think you came into my orbit about 1.5 years ago through either Burgess or the This Is Revolution folks, either one of those things. Sometimes I tend to be a little militant for people who come out of the DSA milieu. That's actually changed, believe it or not. I'm both slightly less aggressive, and the DSA is slightly more militant. Well, the DSA body membership, I'm actually going to be very specific on here, is slightly more militant than it used to be. The actual organization is probably less so. But one thing I've noticed, though, is you really tried to refocus in on solidarity. And I sat down many years ago with my friend Esri XK on moral science, and we started talking about liberté, fraternity, and equality, right? And how everybody skips out fraternity, and what we think fraternity should be changed to get rid of the whole, not just a patriarchal metaphor, but also there's some nationalistic elements in the fraternity idea, is solidarity. But when I see that word thrown around, and this is our next definition, I don't think most people know what it means. So how do you define solidarity, and why has it become a major focus of your work?
Let's see. So one of the reasons why it's a major focus of my work is just the need for it, frankly. I just think I've also changed a lot over the last several years. For most of my life, like, my parents come from a part of India where, members of my family are part of the Communist Party, et cetera, from West Bengal. So that kind of stuff was never unfamiliar to me, but I definitely was more of a liberal still, even with that background, being in the States up until maybe 2015, 2016. And then since the pandemic, I've really had to push myself to really identify both the issues that we're facing and how to actually solve them. So that's one of the reasons why solidarity has been so important to me. It's like a need, just to, I want to win power. I want us to win power and actually have a better life, because life right now is really difficult. So I really need this. We all need this. And then also it is part of my research though. So when I used to be a full-time reporter, and that meant moving along Northeast. I've been to upstate New York, I've been to Jersey City, where, I'm from Jersey originally. So seeing different kinds of folks facing not the exact same issues necessarily, or facing issues that are similar, but not always in the exact same way, but nonetheless facing things like neoliberalism, the gutting of, work, especially in upstate New York, it affected people who are Black, Puerto Rican, white. So those things started to sort of germinate in my head. And when I got into the program, I just wanted to study essentially, coalitional building between non-white groups, because I wasn't really fond of the narrative that just said demographics is destiny, that somehow, people of color are just going to come together as one mass just like that. So for me, it was always there, that kind of thinking. But again, the last couple of years has really pushed me to take it more seriously. So that's just some of the reasoning for me. And how I would define it, and this is based also, I just want to highlight the work that I've really been reading and learning from. So there's Building a Latino Civil Rights Movement by Professor Sonia Songha Lee. I really recommend everyone reading that book, because there's a lot of lessons there that I took from it. And so solidarity, based on that kind of history and what I've seen kind of worked in the past, reading a lot and also just interviewing people, is kind of people kind of organizing with a couple of things in mind. One, realizing that we may not be sharing the exact same experiences, but we are interconnected to each other. So again, like as a South Asian American, obviously someone who's East Asian did not face the aftermath of 9/11, for example. But nonetheless, we are facing similar enemies, similar kind of constructs that we both have to push up against, right? So my fate is still tied to someone who's East Asian and vice versa. I mean, as we're seeing now with the anti-Asian hate crimes and so on and so forth. And then the other thing which is important about solidarity is you are also admitting that you might have a common political vision of where your society wants to be, right? And I think this is what separates solidarity from even allyship, which is also useful, but it's very momentary, very much might be like issue-based. I know you've talked about it on your, podcast recently about how you're fine with some aspects of popular front politics, but mostly having to do with particular issues. So for that to transform from what you're talking about into solidarity, in my mind, it's when you're also now sharing a common worldview or where you want society to be. I think that sometimes gets ignored a lot, frankly. I think, the left is recovering from 50 plus years of missteps and repression, so I understand the growing pains. But I do still think that sometimes people think of solidarity as just working together for a common goal, versus what I have seen just reading and talking to people who I really, really look up to, like organizers. It's not just that. It's solving an issue, but you're trying to really make something new. And I think that's what I think solidarity truly is. So yeah, that's just a little bit of how I would define it based on some of the research I've done and some things that have been kind of in my head in the last 2 years of being, looking through what's happening even with the pandemic and things like that.
So I think that's really fascinating to me. I come from the Deep South. I was initially actually involved probably more in anti-racist work even than socialist work. This was a high schooler. And I tell this story sometimes as, my first foray into activism was trying to gather signatures for Mumia Abdul-Jamal in the worst neighborhoods outside of Macon, Georgia, and having Black folks more or less laugh at me. And I realized though that like when I lived in a quote transitional neighborhood. That's code word in realtor speak for multiracial neighborhood. In a suburb that was literally split down the tracks, black white. Like it was literally that exact. Like there was a clear geological physical dividing line. And I realized how much I shared, with a lot of with a lot of black people in my neighborhood, and yet since I had moved out of the city, I grew up in my earliest childhood was in a post-industrial city called Augusta, Georgia, that was like 80% black. But since I moved out of that city into kind of these poorer suburbs, there's a lot of trailer parks and whatever in the area, that the ability of like local petite bourgeois to kind of rely, and I wouldn't use those terms as a high school student, but the kind of rely on the racial division in the area as a pretty clear way to stop like unionization, which it effectively had done in the South for forever. I mean, if I know in some of your work you mentioned Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelley, and as just a historical matter of fact, no matter how you feel about the CPUSA in the 20s and 30s, the pivot to the Popular Front in 1936 in America pretty much ended black right solidarity work in the South, and the unions were stopped in their tracks. They never took. I mean, you're talking about places where you're not dealing with deunionization. You're dealing with never have been unionized ever. And you also see this a lot if you study the histories of like the way I might call the first woke capitalist, Carnegie would deliberately use like would deliberately bring desperate workers from the South to break up Manx and Cornish strikers, and then like sell it as a big liberal thing to the papers. Interestingly, from the racial construction standpoint, that event is actually what pushes the Cornish and the Manx miners to identify as white, which they did not really even conceive of themselves of priorly to that.
Right.
People talk about this with the Irish and the Italians, but it gets that specific. And I've always thought about why racial notions of kinships, this is like that, why I want to change fraternity into solidarity, right?
Right.
Why racial notions of kinship kind of usually fill in the gap when there is no solidarity. And for whatever reason, like, and I when I talk about like the situation in the South, it was very clear that the ability to play off the racialization of the settler projects in the southeastern United States with other poor people, at these group of early bourgeois who kind of descended from the planter class, still some tricks about how to keep people from consolidating to deal with that. Now, I say all that as a very long-winded way, though. I also was listening to people around the Obama years just basically talk about how the Democratic Party was going to be the dominant party basically forever because the demographics were a certain way. And, well, black people and other people of color, all vote the same, which, as a historic side note, that's only true after 9/11.
Yeah.
Like that's literally the only time in U.S. history where that's been true.
Yeah.
But going back to that, but I was just thinking, like, that seems absurd to me. I remember particularly thinking about the history of indigenous black relations and their allies, and I use allies there advisedly. We'll get to that in a minute too. In various elements of U.S. politics, and for a long time between, say, 1870 and 1920, you could be pro-indigenous or pro-black, but you were almost never both. And the reasons for that I don't entirely understand. It's a very historical, complicated scenario, but that struck me. So I was like, well, I mean, they're both clearly being oppressed, and they're both clearly used, as parts of different regions of the United States surplus labor to keep the market slack. There's all kinds of stuff going on there, and they are the two most oppressed groups historically in the U.S. And most of North America in general, honestly. yet I can't seem to find hardly anybody in that time period who is pro both.
Right.
And I mean, if you see this, for example, I mean, the most obvious, for example, if you've just gone through American high school, and some of these readings have been cleaned up, but like read Mark Twain when he talks about indigenous versus when he talks about black people. It's night and day different. Even though, yeah, Mark Twain has a lot of the racism of his day, even when he's anti-slavery and anti the beginnings of what was beginning to become Jim Crow. It's still pretty clear that he still views African Americans as a category separate and better than anybody who's indigenous. He just doesn't. He barely talks about them as if they're people.
The guys who, I forgot their name, the people who recently took over federal land.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were very pro-Mexican or pro-Latino.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking and very, very anti-black. I mean, that was like, it just reminded me of that too, because they did the same thing. They were very much like, well, Mexican Americans we know work just as hard as us, but black folks don't. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm in that part of the country actually, so it's actually kind of interesting. Yeah, like the Bundys and those groups.
Bundys,
yeah. Although it was quite interesting too. Some of the, one of the leader's children did take a
BLM's kind of stand.
Be a at least sympathetic view to BLM, which I think shocked a lot of people. And I was like, no, but he hates the government, man. Like his hatred of the government may actually be stronger than his racism if he has it. And while I can somewhat admire that consistency, actually, it's still interesting.
Yeah.
So I bring all this history stuff up because it coincides with what I'm reading in your work in a kind of different way. I Hammer and Hoe I read about 9 years ago, and it blew my mind because even as a Southern leftist, I didn't know any of that. No one had taught me any of that. I knew a lot about civil rights movement, the Black Belt movement, Black nationalism, and yet I didn't know anything about this solidarity work done in particularly in the 1920s, by the CPUSA, and I think people also don't know how radical that was, given that like the SPA, the Socialist Party of America, which I will sing its praises here and there, but the one thing it would not touch,
was Jim Crow. Even when it took, for example, like Debs took, pro-immigrant and pro-black labor stances, but only in a way that was very, explicitly colorblind, almost liberal. But he was the far left on those issues in the SPA. Like there were people that we would consider like social chauvinist and even maybe proto-fascist in the SPA in the 1980s. He spoke out against like the Birth of a Nation movie, I think. I know like the famous examples that he got letters for, which is great, but I never viewed him as necessarily the issue. But yeah, when you read that book, I would argue, it's more like very much leaning towards the fascist side of things when you have people who are just like, we don't even need to deal with Jim Crow, like white socialists. Like we just need to not even deal with it. They're not, African Americans are not able to be mobilized or organized even. It's very paternal, very racist view. And so the Communist Party coming in was like, I know people have also critiques about the some of their theories about a black nation in the South. But at the same time, for its era, it was at least like very progressive and trying to like at least recognize literally the South is Jim Crow. You need to deal with this issue if you're going to deal with anything, especially as a bloc that's going to infect the rest of the country. Like having this bloc of reactionaries, having a very safe place for reactionaries to keep winning power is obviously bad for African Americans, for a lot of folks in the region, but is also bad for national politics, which proved to be the case in the 30s and 40s when you're forced to like, quote unquote, build, at least New Deal liberals building these weird coalitions with them that would, really hold back what should have been a much more radical kind of politics. So I think the CPUSA at least was trying to think that through rather than the Socialist Party being like, well, we should just ignore it or don't even care. Which is
ignore it, or like it's maybe not even a problem. Like,
right, that's so bizarre.
I mean, another famous stance, which Des actually opposed, but I've had people defend Victor Verger's vote on this to me,
I don't know that.
which was the opposition to immigrant Asian labor and the promotion of quotas. Now, I will say that Berger's specific gloss on that was written against the corporations and not the immigrants themselves, but within the debates within the party,
right,
it's pretty clear that that a lot of the SPA had the same views as the Knights of Labor.
right,
had just 10 years problem. And people who don't know about the Knights of Labor, Powderly, like, at first kind of condemned the anti-Asian massacres, but then sort of backed off. And so, and these are kinds of things, like if you read something like, I say, Settlers by Jay Sakai, which is not a work of history I would strongly endorse, to be honest, but there are real things in it, and this is the kind of stuff that you have to deal with.
right.
So I find that very interesting. I also find it interesting in the context of internationalism, because I'm fascinated and terrified by the work of Adam Praswarsky, the former analytic Marxist who game theoretic the various outcomes for working class politics in a social democratic coalition, and within a singular nation in a democratic context, he basically works out that it's kind of impossible not to start getting into bourgeois developmental interests and start subordinating your class politics to that. My answer to that has always been, that's why we're internationalists.
Right.
Like just, it's like really simple. It's like, that's why we're internationalists, because we realize that within one nation that we are kind of stuck in a certain kind of developmental paradigm. And I was going to ask you about that, because I know that, you having family tied to the Communist Party of India, that these kinds of debates are really big and really important in the Communist Party of India. One of the kind of bigger dividing lines between like them and, say, like the Maoist insurgents and stuff like that has to do with this vision of nationalism and internationalism. So how do you define internationalism? I know it's crucial to your work, but
so I mean, so one of the things I touch on in the piece for Counterpunch that I was talking about solidarity is internationalism at the end of it, I believe, because I've written about it in the past, and I'm still trying to think about how do we actually do that kind of work. But for me, at least, internationalism, at least as a US leftist, means developing relationships with other progressive forces in other parts of the world, developing relationships, again, for a common end, not just goals, which means, like, of course, the diminishment or the ending of the US empire, and also creating the kind of spaces for us to really make sure that there's no room for any kind of capitalist class reactionary elements to sort of ever succeed again. And that's why I think internationalism is so important, even for US leftists, because, we have a tendency to really think just about ourselves domestically, frankly. And internationalism still, I think, comes off as a secondary issue. Some of that has changed because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I feel like there's a lot more writing about internationalism over the last year or two, having to do with some of what Bernie Sanders spoke about, in terms of Yemen, things like that. But still, there's a long way to go to understand just how materially important it is too. Like, if you don't have these connections to other countries, even if we have a soc dem kind of person win power here, and let's just say they have enough of a majority to not give a crap about the Supreme Court or other things, the capitalists themselves are just going to go to other places, or they're, they have this whole alliance built in the world that really needs them to succeed in the US, right? Like, I know you also brought this up with India and Modi, with the Philippines, with just forces in Latin America. There is a back and forth process. I think there's a tendency to sometimes view like US imperialism being like just a top-down project of just like the US forcing every country to have a certain type of politics versus
If only that was true, honestly.
Right. That would make it much easier because you'll have a really big mass constituency, but it's still like a minority. I do think there is a minority constituency in a lot of these countries that want US help, but nonetheless, they are a mobilized group. Like in India, the Hindutva project, I think can survive maybe a little bit without US support, obviously, because India's relationship to US politics has always been, very different. Like the US.
Yeah. I think India, just as a side note, is the hardest of the major regions and countries outside of the West for Westerners, even Western leftists, to understand. That's why I feel like it doesn't get brought up much because it's like, there's a lot of people there. Politics there is weird. Bye. Like,
there's a lot of people there, or they get wrapped up in very simple discussions about the area. Like, for example, caste is my family is from the Brahmin caste, the top caste, basically the effed up class, the caste that needs to be overthrown. But at the same time, it is caste and class and gender and all these other things. And I think sometimes people take one thing like caste, which is important, but they take that one thing and they're like, yeah, it's a caste system. Or they will look at the Hindu-Muslim divide and not understand the fact that this is not new also, and that the people who, for example, founded the RSS, the Hindu right-wing militia groups, they are literally founded based on Italian fascist principles. So
yeah, they talk about the Semitic problem, but their Semitic problem is Muslim, not Jewish.
Yes.
Like, they're explicit about that.
Yes. And I think that's the thing that even when I talk to, like, my parents are like, they're fairly liberal now, like not as radical as they were, but that's the one thing they always jokingly say. That is the connective tissue of a lot of these Hindu right-wing groups, or all these right-wing groups, is that they just hate Muslims, right? And I think sometimes that gets overlooked. Sometimes I feel like only recently with the Kashmir occupation being so explicit, for I think a hot minute, like a month maybe, people were paying attention to it slightly more, at least on the DSA side. I know I run the PolEd, and we actually invited members who have connections to India to organize a little panel that we inform people what's going on. But yeah, I think India itself is just, it's not only big because China is big, but it is also a country that you have so many languages, you have so many different kind of faiths, you have so many kind of regional stuff. Like Modi's rise as a Bengali American, even though I'm born and raised here, I know a lot of my family hate him, but not really politically, but they don't like him because he is, from Western India or Gujarati. They don't trust him in that sense. So that's also there. So how do you explain that to people? But I think, to be honest, I think a lot of it still falls on the fact that on the left, there's still a little bit of a lack of just thinking about Asia in a way that's fairly more complicated. Because the same thing happens to China sometimes, where you have these weird divisions where people either want to portray China as a socialist project that's amazing, or somebody who wants to portray China as like the next fascist country for some reason, and you got to pick and choose. And I think it's like it's a problem.
It's a unified culture too, which I think is kind of
right.
I was like, anyone who spent 5 minutes in two different regions of China knows that's not remotely true.
Right.
But which admittedly, though, to be fair, most people in the United States have not been out of their region of the United States.
Yeah.
And this includes I used to get in trouble about going off on this when I was in New York, because I'd hear these New Yorkers tell me, about the city of the world and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, when's the last time you left your borough? Like, yes, you do have exposure to the media and to the elite classes of the entire world in a city like that, like you do in London, like you do in Seoul, like you do in Beijing. But that's not a robust knowledge of the world, right? And I think that's another thing that some of your work gets to is, I one of the things I always think about a Lenin quote. Now, people know my feelings about Lenin. It's complicated, but Lenin would talk about how a good social democrat, and this is when he was writing in, he was still part of the social democrats, is able to move amongst all the social classes in society with relative ease, and to know what, not just in a statistical way, not just in a what are their abstract interests way, but to know their like material ways of life, and how they might be thinking on the ground at any given time. And I find that on the left, and this is directly related to solidarity, that's just not the case. Like, that people often extrapolate based off their personal experience too much. They don't move around. I would often, I give people who throw around PMC a lot of grief, because I think as a construction of class, it doesn't really work. But I will say that there is a truth that, like, the cultural norms of a certain strata of workers and petit bourgeois professionals in urban environments are assumed to be way more universal than they are.
Right.
And I don't mean that in this sense of like, oh, you should go and, tail conservatives. I'm like, okay. To bring up a cultural debate that I thought was stupid, but we still had to deal with, was like the Dave Chappelle debate. And I was like, well, for all of the tensions that brings up, there are some things that you probably don't want to hear as a leftist about certain common stereotypes in, say, blue-collar Black communities in the South that Chappelle actually is giving voice to. And you kind of don't want to hear it.
Right.
And I do think that and this is different. I think a person who's interested in solidarity and building solidarity has to hear that,
right,
has to acknowledge it is real, but then not do the tailless thing and say, oh, we're going to try to like flatter that,
right,
and pretend that that's a good. No, I mean, we have to be like, okay, how do we get these two? What are the interest and common vision that people from these two groups would actually share?
Right.
Because that's going to break down the walls, and that's going to put them in contact with each other in a non-hostile way. And that actually gets rid of, a lot of the racial attitudes, et cetera, and so forth.
I just wanted to add, so that is something that, well, firstly, I do agree with there's a tendency to sometimes write and extrapolate based on one's experience, which is valuable. But I think what I've been trying to do also with this piece is ask other experts and historians what they think. And again, I go back to Professor Sonia Sanha Lee's work, because in that work, and she, I interviewed her too, so these kind of quotes are from her talking to me, and she said, like, you don't assume, based on much, that people are going to say this thing or that thing. You're going to have to hear what they're really saying. But I think I think there's a couple of problems that some people come up across, whether in good faith or whatever. One problem is some of us are so removed from certain groups of people that, like you said, we don't want to hear certain things, or just very ignorant of just other people's ignorance, frankly. Like, that's just the reality of it. But then the other approach, which is very weird, is like the tailism approach. So when they hear something, they think it's the authentic working class experience, and therefore, oh, they said some shitty things about, to be fair, another working class person with another identity. It's cool because, I hear what the real people say. And I'm like, I'm from a middle class background in the suburbs, so I'm not trying to pretend, but I don't like to pretend, period. But I'll be real. I've been around a lot of working people. Guess what? Some of them are mad annoying. Some of them are cool. Some of them are not. They're just people. And
some of them really are racist, by the way.
Right,
Don't try to pretend they're not. Like
that's
exactly.
why I get lost sometimes. Like, I'm very suspicious when people do that too, where they have this really weird view of just like this authentic chef's kiss, like amazing person who's just saying all the awful things. I'm like, that sounds still pretty shitty. They're still a person. Wouldn't you want them to change? So I just want to say, like, there's the danger of not wanting to hear things because you're going to hear shitty things. So the one approach, which is not to hear that's wrong. But then the other approach, which I think is what the professor I mentioned is talking about, other groups have done, which is they're not also accepting that either. They're just saying that people come to the space wherever they're organizing as who they are, but there's still the goal of and belief that they can change. Because it's not only about building a safer environment for everyone, it is about handling these differences to make sure the fight is much more unified for these bigger, bolder fights. So it's materially, like, you can't have a bunch of people who are transphobic and saying crazy shit like in your movement if they're really creating
Right.
these divisions. I mean, morally, I'm against it because that's messed up. But also strategically, if someone is like not even understanding, I'm like, what do you think is going to happen? This person or two people or three people are going to be in both. It can only take like, believe me, I've been in rooms where it's like two people who are loud enough to just make a whole stink about something and be really like phobic in some ways to really make everyone else feel so put off, right? Especially like women, non-men. So it's like, also strategically, don't you want everyone to feel like this is their fight, they can be who they want to be and also fight these other problems? And I think that's the other thing that I get so frustrated. And that's the other reason why I wrote this piece, because I did want to identify the complicated thing that, yes, people are problematic, but you're still going to have to, like you said, bring them together in ways where they can work out that problematic behavior without being problematic anymore, and have everyone realize, again, the common vision thing, which takes more time, by the way. Like that also is not going to happen in 2 weeks. For everyone to believe that not only are you fighting for better wages or not having a rent hike, that you're trying to fight for the control of the building, that's also going to take some time. So it's a whole reinforcement mechanism that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. One of the things I think about is how many people who consider themselves organizers take their cues from marketing. And I actually do think left media, as much as I am a part of it in some way, is kind of to blame about this, because like, you know, you look at the trends on the socials, and then you have a show on the trends on the socials, and I'm always telling people, you know, and that, you know, we try to convince people with debate or whatever, and I'm always like, that's not really how this is done. Like, I personally am against debate, but I'm not against people who do it, right? But my point more is that, like, that's an entertainment strategy. You might convince one person superficially, but it's also very superficial, so something else could, like, cause a reversion very quickly.
Yeah.
And whereas a lot of these kind of, you know, if you work in a union, and a lot of unions, let's be honest, kind of suck, let's not lie. And you have to deal with, say, workers' unions and with teachers, and you have like very opposed groups. Well, one of the things about teachers' unions that I don't think people understand, it's actually kind of funny, is because the local dues are cheaper in rural areas, in most states, because it's just cheaper to operate. There's actually more rural and suburban members of teachers unions than urban members of teachers unions, because the urban dues are usually dramatically higher, which means, despite the fact that you would think that the union workers would represent kind of urban teachers' interests, that's absolutely not true. And so you have a lot of times uniserv leaders, political organizers, and you know, urban union members who hold stereotypically progressive views, who are, and they often are the leadership. They're often some of the better organizers. However, they're organizing a base of people that are like largely in rural schools, who might be Trumpist, who do whatever. And I pointed out that this has always been true in unions in like Western states and in places outside of, like, you know, New England and like the West Coast. This has always been a dynamic that's very real. It's very real in the Midwest as well. But what you see in other time periods is when they had clear goals, and I mean clear goals beyond just you know, pay hikes and stuff like that. Those unions were often still very militant. Right? Like the Utah Teachers Union in 1981, which was full of nothing but Mormons, to be honest, was one of the most militant unions for teachers in the United States in 1981. That's no longer true. Like, it's actually one of the more right wing, state branches of the NEA. I bring that up though because it is the common political vision, all right, which admittedly in the United States is further complicated by Taft-Hartley, and social unionizing and by that I mean doing things beyond just the workplace and how you do your union work, that enabled that militancy to happen amongst people who would not have associated themselves priorly with who they would have seen as, urban progressive elites. They would have had no time for that. And yet, they were willing to fight for everyone's rights, including indigenous, indigenous and res teachers. That was something that you saw in the 80s that you don't see now. And yeah, it was also crushed by Reaganism. Yeah, it ultimately lost, but it did shut down the state schools for like a month or something. There was a pretty massive strike. And again, most teachers, even the ones in the union in Utah, don't know this history at all. Right. And so I think that vision of solidarity is super important. When I talk about Popular Front versus United Front stuff, I'm a Second International United Frontist. But I point out specifically though that strategy wasn't designed for a congressional representative system. It was actually designed specifically for a parliamentary system, and it doesn't make a lot of sense in our system, which is why I have to kind of modify it on issues-based stuff. But the thing I think that you're important is what you call solidarity. I think solidarity is rooted in what I would call programmatic unity. We all even someone like James Baldwin talks about this. If someone's a bigot and they just don't like you, but they're not going to stand in your way, they're not going to enforce it legally, they're just an asshole. They're not really that dangerous. If you combine that bigotry with power and then with systemic disenfranchisement, that's a nightmare scenario. And so one of my things is I'm not trying to convince everyone on the left to have perfect moral views. I want to convince them that it is in their interest to hopefully they do have better, right? But if they don't, but they can see that it's in their interest to just not act on it.
Right.
That's actually a massive improvement. And the only way you do that is solidarity, programmatic unity, having a clear vision for what you want and what you achieve. Right. I'm pretty sure that the Mormon teachers in 1981 were perfectly willing to fight for queer teachers. I'm also pretty sure they were probably all bigots on that. Well, not all, but a vast majority of them were bigots on that issue.
Right.
So, how do you deal with that? Because I do think when we look at how do I say this? When I look at something, I'll even mention Marx here. Marx says in private letters, some pretty shitty things. Mm-hmm. The most famous one is what he called LaSalle, which is also weird because it could have easily been said about him.
About Indians too, he wasn't really. I mean, he evolved, but definitely said some things that were, problematic to say.
Yeah, pre-1860, his line on India is really. Right. I mean, it's basically, imperialism's kind of bad, but colonialism's civilizing the savages. It's basically what he says. And even though he was an explicit, abolitionist and advocate for black people in the United States in his letters, he's not without anti-black bigotry. It's there, it's clearly there. What is interesting about him, and as a good model though, he never said any of that shit in public.
Right.
And while I'm not saying that no, there is implicit bias. Yes, these bigotries matter. It is still important to acknowledge that some people knew that it was more important to put that shit behind you when you were trying to deal with organizing workers and with fighting for freedom, and that objectively the oppression of black people into chattel slavery was not just bad for them, and it is, and absolutely is morally repugnant, but also is bad for everybody else too.
Right.
And that's and I think that's important, right?
Yeah, I mean, so when I think about this stuff, I'm also thinking like my main research focus and the reason why I went back into academia was to really think these things through, like I mentioned at the top of the show, having to do with non-white folks. Because, I'm from Jersey, I'm from New York City originally. The spaces I'm in when I'm thinking about this stuff are, there are white folks. Usually, to be really honest, before going back into academia, my relationship to white people was very much not a positive one either, after like racism and stuff like that happening. So even back then I was thinking about these things mostly having to do between non-white groups, but now also with white people too. But so when thinking about it, I know plenty of folks, family wise, friends, who are brown or black, have said problematic things about each other, have made jokes to one another, to me, right, where I would be like, nowadays I'm like, I don't know about that, that doesn't sound right. But at the same time, I've seen these people shift their thinking in ways that are still valuable. I think it's not so much about being an asshole behind, I know that's not what you're saying really, but I'm just saying it's not so much of being like having these views behind closed doors versus in front of these doors. It's more like a priority of values, right? So I definitely think people are going to stumble and say things. And again, I'm assuming people on the liberal side of things, sort of, right? There's a certain line for me also where it's like, dude, I'm confronting you. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, you're a right-wing person or whatever. But there's also liberal, apolitical types who will say problematic things. For me, most of the focus should be, though, is whether or not they view that other person who they view as maybe an other as being part of some kind of community that they want to build with in the future. So that's what I view as the main crux of it. So again, as an activist, so I'm a support role, but still I'm around a lot of people who, again, say things about even themselves. Like, I made a joke recently about how growing up, family members and people I know say about Hispanic folks Spanish, right? Like, it doesn't, it's not right. Like, that means they're like Spaniard. They're talking about Latino folks. And, I've met other people of color who just call maybe everybody Asian or Chinese or something weird. Like, even if there might be different types of East Asian or Southeast Asian. And as a South Asian person, I know a ton of different things that people say about each other: Pakistani, Bangladeshi, American, Indian. But again, for me, I know also folks who still think about themselves as being like South Asian, for example, or think of themselves as being Asian, being working class, or being connected to that other person. I think that's the way I see it. It's like, what do you prioritize the most? So you have your shitty joke, which I still will say to you, maybe you should not say as often, but are you going to be down to show up for something? Are you going to actually not just not be in someone's way, but actually be there for this larger fight? And I think, to me, that is the main thing you need to build to. And to your other point, you need to socialize that to people. I think the other reason why I'm a little bit more humble about where people are coming from is because we live in America, where literally people really don't have any kind of relationship to these broader, or they don't have much of a relationship to collectives that are really about building a certain kind of community. Because there are communities. I don't think of this the Thatcherite claim that there's only individuals and families. There are communities. But right now, I think most of those communities lean reactionary, even if, like, say, the church, the mosque, the temple, or other things that are going on. So how do we create a countervailing force? Because that's what's missing. I think of these things materially in that way. It's not because people just want to be problematic or people just want to be shitty to each other. It's literally they don't have a language or relationship to people who they think don't share their common view. And where I live right now, I live in an apartment in the New Jersey area. Like, where we live is very mixed. It's a ton of African-American folks, Indian folks, and there's still tensions, though. And there's also white folks, right? There's still tensions. But when I look at the different people here, I can recognize, if I were to organize, there would still be things I could do to still create that bigger worldview that they could see that, yes, this person might be Indian or this person might be African-American, and we may have some other issues, but at the very minimum, we need these other things to happen. But how do you build that? I also am not entirely sure sometimes, because that's the thing that I've been trying to rack my brain, or because that's why I say I'm an activist. I am very busy with teaching and researching. But in the past, I know our chapter has done things like cookouts, for example. Things like that are also just beyond just organizing. Because I still think people can also be bored by that. They don't want to be constantly interacting with people only when they have to do like something like that, like doing a petition. Maybe they need to build a kind of different type of community through cookouts and other kinds of events.
I think that is interesting, and I think I'm gonna tell a little story that sounds like I'm crapping on my white friends in the DSA, but I'm not, because it was an important learning experience for them. The DSA chapter in Salt Lake City, as you imagine, even though it's decolonialized, it's not the DSA here, it's the DSSL because they decolonized it, and I say that with a certain amount of snark. But one thing I will say is there was a mutual event on the west side of Salt Lake, and if you don't know the geography, I live in the west side of Salt Lake. Salt Lake's west side is like 60% Latino or Pacific Islander or African immigrant, specifically, actually, because there are very few people who are descendants of slaves here, and we went to do a solidarity effort with the Brown Berets, and I felt really bad for these DSA folks because they all like huddled together in a little alabaster ball, and I was like, no, you were invited here.
Right.
You need to go eat. You need to like go talk to people. And a lot of it is that they were really trying to not insert themselves, and like I want to actually say this wasn't because of just white liberal ignorance. It was also because like they were trying to respect the space, and I was
Right.
like, no, you were invited, you are a guest. Go enjoy things and intermix, because this is important that you do that. It is important that you know these communities, that you know these kids, that you are seen sincerely interacting with these, with the Brown Berets and the community in which they are serving, as equal partners of which you are in dialogue and will listen to, and that you are doing common working with them and breaking bread and socializing with them. And the latter part is something you aren't used to, and it's uncomfortable, and it is uncomfortable the first few times you do it. Like it's, I mean, it's as my minority friends have told me, it's super uncomfortable for them too when they're at like, they get invited to some progressive liberal dinner and it's like Whitey Mac Whitey stand. Like it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that I think a lot of white activists miss, it's uncomfortable between different groups of people of color.
Yeah.
Like, one thing I remember dealing with in Macon, Georgia, was there was a lot of anti-Southeast Asian immigrant sentiment in the Black community that led to like, at one point it led to like gang targetings and stuff, and it was kind of, I remember the white activists in the area feeling like they couldn't insert themselves into that, and like part of me is like, yeah, you can't, but another part of me is like, but this kind of bigotry is prohibitive for us getting anything done, no matter who it's from, whether it's from Joe Bob or someone else. It really doesn't. It has the same destructive effect, because we all live. I mean, in these particular, like, in America, the only thing worse than being gentrified is not being gentrified. Like if you've ever lived in some of these communities, right? Like, where everything's just allowed to go to shit, and then like there's just all kinds of violence. And I used to work in a prison, right? Like, and so the one thing I will tell you is those conditions, you can send even a fairly not racist person into those conditions, and because of the stresses in organizations and stuff that already is there, they will have to adopt certain kinds of racial attitudes. Is one of the most horrible things about prison, actually. and that's, it's encouraged by the jailers in some way too, because
Right.
it makes them easier to control, frankly.
Right.
But I think about that a lot, and I think about that in the context of places in the Southeast, but I also think about it in context of, like, you're talking about New Jersey, where, like, yeah, there's white people, but that's not the only tension or anything you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
but mhm.
I just want to add the other thing that I do want to highlight and stress is also there's also other divisions, like you're saying. It could also be divisions between people who've become naturalized and how they feel about undocumented folks still, right? You can see that
that's
as a
huge.
fissure, right? And
Yeah.
I do want to touch on that too, because I think there's also a way of looking at this need for unity, not just as, oh, we just need everyone to believe in each other. It's also, again, back to like what you said, we don't want, these things are prohibitive to creating that unity we need. Obviously, like, look at the Black Panther Party. This is one of the critiques. Well, Shada Shakur had another critique about the Black Panther Party, which was that it didn't do enough sometimes, like really developing a lot of organizers or leadership. That was her critique. But the other critique is it had an amazing worldview, frankly, when it comes to internationalism, domestic stuff. Like, it was very, very. I get so frustrated when there's a tendency to reduce what they were trying to say to these boilerplate.
They were just Black nationalists, like
Yeah.
the new Black Panther Party.
I mean, they
which is
fought
absolutely
with
not true.
Yeah, they fought with Black cultural nationalists, and Karenga and everyone literally hated them because they were mocking the other side, saying all these different things, like you can't be a bourgeoisie of whatever. But one of the things that did really not that great was, of course, dealing with the fact of like sexism in the group, dealing with the fact that they had a lot of female organizers, frankly, but not a lot of them in leadership. But I bring that up because in the end, that really weakened them to a lot of these like FBI attacks and these other things. And you had a lot of men who are also, to be honest, I think were informants too, designed to do this kind of thing, but also men getting caught up in the hubris of just like, let's just, have a violent attack or something, like this very gung-ho mentality. And like for the undocumented stuff too, it's both morally wrong to have a labor movement, for example, that doesn't include undocumented folks, but it's also objectively stupid, right, to not include them because they're so vital to our economy, And then thirdly, if you are going to include them, you just can't presuppose that they just come along. You're going to have to deal with those other obstacles standing in their way for them to feel safer to be part of your movement. So that means dealing with ICE, right? So I'm just bringing it up because I do think sometimes there's also a tendency just to view the argument of solidarity or no solidarity as also just like a moral sort of like, are you inclusive enough? Rather than tactically sound, and then connected to that, what do you need to do? This is why ICE, getting rid of ICE is so vital. It's not just a moral issue, which it is. It's also very much like, how do you expect undocumented folks to be part of the mainstream labor movement if they really are worried about being arrested, right? Or being chased down? Like, that stuff needs to happen too. And to your point about New Jersey, I think so. For me, like in New Jersey, you have a Democratic Party that's Republicanism is really in the South Jersey part. It's a little bit peppered here and there. It can always come up here and there, right? We've had Republican governors that people seem to forget. But now the fissure to me is not so much as like non-white white. It is certainly white racism. Like a lot of the folks who went down to January 6th were from Jersey. I've met a lot of these folks, some version of them in my life, they're being dicks to me and me being like, what the fuck? Like, you live in New Jersey. But there's also the other issues now that are happening. Class, obviously, right? You have a Democratic Party that understands it has to be multiracial. So it's not going to be obviously quote unquote racist. You also have some Republicans doing the same too. There was, I think, one of the candidates who ran on the Republican ticket locally was Indian American. But Indian Americans are, predominantly Democrat. But that doesn't, again, get to the issue of like, there's still fissures. There's still fissures around what do we mean by being, what do we mean by progressivism? What do we mean by change in society? Those things don't just magically go poof because suddenly you have people working together on certain things. And that's what I also want to reinforce. Solidarity to me is not just like how we think about bipartisanship, like people just working together. People can work together for a lot of good and bad things. Solidarity to me, the way I see it as a Marxist, is, again, sharing a common goal, that goal obviously being socialism, a type of socialism, and of course then in that sense building the unity and capacity for that to happen, which goes back to what you said earlier, like how do we navigate people's socialization, how do we navigate people's worldviews, and also how do we navigate people's processes of learning together? Because people are not going to learn things at the same time. Like, again, I know for a fact that people in my community who are South Asian American, working class or middle class would be really benefited from socialism here and anywhere. But some of them, it's going to take a little longer for them to figure that out. And it's going to be not just awkward conversations. I am pretty sure some of them are just going to be like, hey, I just want this thing to be better. And then I'm out. I don't want to partake too much with these other groups or whomever. So how do we deal with that? How do we make sure that people really understand that not only is it important for them morally to be with someone, but it's so important for them long term that they actually continue developing these bonds and these relationships, which again, they're not used to. That's the other thing. People in the United States are not used to socializing with enough people from different communities, period.
Right, yeah.
Segregated society. Even in New Jersey, you drive from one area to the next. It's like so different, like from each other. And these communities don't mix. They only mix maybe on certain events, celebrations, maybe. But all in all, separate supermarkets, separate everything, pretty much.
It's one of the interesting things about being a teacher at a district level as opposed to a teacher at a school site level is I actually have to move in different communities that are radically different from each other and are maybe 10 miles apart.
Yeah.
And they don't know really anything about each other. And one thing that I will say, and for all the talk of diversity and inclusion, I had to sit down with, I had to sit down with my, with some activist friends of mine around my partner, and there's a bunch of people of color there, and I was great. And then I was like, they were talking to me. We were doing outreach to the undocumented and migrant community here, trying to give them resources to deal with ICE to stay legal, how they could do that, how not to be entrapped, et cetera, and so forth. And a lot of the white activist friends just realized, other than speaking Spanish, a lot of the people they were dealing with also were just as alien from that community at this point, even if they came from it. And this is what I was trying to point out, as some of them were. And I was like, that's because you're selecting for educated activists who speak impeccable English, who know the cultural norms of progressive and left society, who know that we're going to check our pronouns. And I don't say that to disparage it or anything like that. I'm not pulling an Angela Eagle thing, but they know this process. Right. They know what we're doing. Migrant workers from El Salvador are unlikely to have been exposed to a lot of that. And so, yeah, of course you have a cultural gap, and just being of the same race or ethnic background doesn't automatically transcend that.
Right.
That's a very superficial notion of the way culture works. Right. And so I'm like, if you want to do that, you got to go out in those communities. You got to eat with them. You got to go to the quinceañeras. You got to go there. They it's not the same as people coming to you. And it really changed their approach. But it was funny because I was just I was trying to tell them, do you assume that all classes of white people operate the same way? Right. You know better, and whether you have positive or negative stereotypes about that or whatever.
Right.
And I will say this, a lot of liberals who are a lot of liberals and leftists and progressives who are the worst about this are not just white. They're white people from formerly working class backgrounds who have moved to places like, say, New York and California to get away from that. Mm-hmm. Because they also are distancing. They're doing a social distancing with elements that are on past, which they see as regressive, reactionary, and they're probably not wrong. Right. But they're not looking at, okay, well, in what ways do you have to get some of those people on board and some of those people to drop their bullshit? And just saying that they're regressive is not going to do that. That's just going to make them hate you. And so that's been a kind of issue. It's interesting to watch, but it goes back to that thing we were saying about half an hour ago. Like, a lot of people's response to that is like, well, we're just going to like start saying, yeah, of course we accept, like, immigration is bad for socialist movements and stuff like that. And I'm just like, yeah, that's not going to work. Like,
well, it's an aesthetic politics. I think I wrote that down based on something you were saying earlier. You said marketing, for example.
Yeah.
I think it's aesthetics too. Like there are people who think of leftism or socialism or even communism as one would think about aesthetics. Like it's a certain person you have to identify with. It's a certain kind of person you think you have to identify with. And honestly, it's like if you are a leader, I'm saying about not just like the rank and file person who's just getting into leftism or socialism. Like if you are someone who, again, has a YouTube show or podcast or writes, and you're going on and on about, like, say you said, like the PMC class, like the reason, so you're like, I agree with you. I know, also being in academia, and also I'm kind of, I don't want to say part of that, but like certainly I'm sure I've echoed certain PMC-esque statements in the past, but I know that exists in a way. Like there is a subset of people who think of politics in that kind of way, but if your beef is like saying it's them, or like the PMC does not, they are professional managerial, but it's always usually the educators or something bizarre when those people are not managers really. They're certainly professional.
Yeah, they mean anyone with a degree. Sometimes it's like wild.
It's also frustrating because literally that's like, so are you saying, again, that's what I mean by aesthetics. It's like this authenticity, ironically, that they play into too. Like to be a working person, you need to be, quote unquote, not have a degree or something only, or to live in a certain part of the country.
Yeah, you need to be a blue collar worker, which I literally today just pointed out to people. Right. What is traditionally defined as blue collar work only makes up 13.9% of wage earners in the United States.
Right.
And that I'm including logistics workers, factory workers, and like farm wage labor.
Right.
And I'm like, that's like, you posit like, oh, well, the PMC is only 40% of the population, gets the vast majority of blue collar workers, who is actually a much smaller subset. Like, and like, look, worldwide, that's not true, of course, but even worldwide, the quote blue collar work, I don't think there's any country on earth that it's above 45% of the population.
Yeah.
Particularly if you don't include like peasants and stuff in that. And so I start looking at it, and I'm like, well, why are you appealing to this? Is that not the majority of the population? Like before COVID, I would also say, like, okay, who do you think the average worker is?
Right.
Like, statistically speaking, the average worker in America is a person who makes between $25,000 and $40,000, and before the year 2020 was most likely female. And you could flip a quarter on whether or not they were white or of color.
Right.
And that is the statistical majority worker. I think now it's no longer majority female, but it's still pretty close.
Right.
And so I point that out. I'm like, so when you're thinking about hard hat dudes who do construction from the 50s, are industrial workers who in smelting plants from the 50s, those people are frankly, they've been mostly replaced by robots. So like, who do you think you're talking about exactly? And you're right, it's like this aesthetic evocation of what it meant to be working class at a particular time period of a particular group.
But also it's like, so it's funny because like these are discussions, there are tensions, like what we're talking about, it's still very much about, there are tensions there are certain ways of behaving or being that can push people away that we need. But the way that some people think about these tensions is not so much like for me, there are material differences, for example, among working class people. Like
hell yeah, there are.
If undocumented folks, you're going to face more obstacles in that, being a working class person. But that doesn't negate the need for class struggle. That's one thing. Like, I don't know why people think that it has to be exactly the same for class struggle to happen. That's not the case. Like, not everyone
has to. It's never gonna happen either. Like,
never gonna happen.
Like, just sectors of the economy, like like if you talk about like relative exploitation rates, for example, like people in logistics get paid better because if they strike, the system shuts down. That doesn't that like, and thus they have slightly different interests, right? And that's always going to be the case. But it doesn't mean that they don't have like a socialist program that was any kind of robust would address their needs, the needs of poor workers, needs of undocumented workers, the needs of a lot of things. And just like how race could be used as a clear dividing line to create tensions of like the working class of the South, I definitely see in the Latin community documentation status being used that way. And I think people are sometimes taken aback, particularly white leftists who aren't familiar with the West, like how much of like ICE enforcement is Latino, and like that's not a small thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's just like how a lot of the like most of the soldiers in the Civil War and the Confederate side didn't own slaves either, or
soldiers in the colonial armies, like India, for example, or South Asia. It wasn't all Irish and Scot-Irish people doing that work. It was the empire, of course, pitting people, but again, giving people certain material incentives to want to be trained and get this like interesting and better paid work as part of the military, who then puts down all these other rebellions in the subcontinent. Like these are always going to be there. But at the same time, for those same soldiers, it benefits them long term to create a society that's not ruled by the English or British. And I think the frustrating part for me sometimes, again, this is not, I just want to reinforce that these are not conversations I'm necessarily hearing from people in my chapter necessarily. I think that's okay, because I think a lot of people in my chapter are doing a lot of great work. But I'm just worried sometimes when I see people who are part of the social media world or YouTube world or podcast, which is important because these are people who some of my friends listen to, right? Because they're working and they're busy, who might, again, have this weird view that dealing with difference cannot be dealt with in a material way, that any kind of suggestion of difference is like a diversion, or that there's an authentic working class struggle versus all these diversionary things to discuss versus, what we're trying to say, or at least, what I've been trying to write about, which is, no, there are I'm viewing this not as a rhetorical thing. There are material differences in the working class that are going to have to be addressed while we build up our capacity to fight, right? So for me, the contradiction is still capital, because, you can have a more diverse set of actors being in power positions, but nonetheless, capitalism, exploitation, and insecurity. Like one thing I like to highlight is that if you're a white collar worker, it is still important for you to want to have socialism because capitalism is also very unstable. And now we're seeing a lot of middle class and some white folks freaking the F out about this. And that's why they're just running to like some reactionary ideas. But there's also elements of that happening among middle class people of color who may fall into the neoliberal thinking. Like I'll vote for a Democrat and whatever Democrat Biden or someone says to vote for, I'll vote for them because I don't want the Republican who are crazy. So for me, these are material conversations, though. These aren't like, you're mentioning race or you're mentioning gender, therefore you're mentioning internationalism or immigration. You're mentioning something the working class can't think about. It's like, I'm sorry, but they're going to have to. We all are going to have to think about, deal with if we want to win power. And I just referenced that because there is like this article that I wrote it's kind of taking umbrance at a couple of things. It's taking a little bit of a challenge to obviously folks who are more liberal, who may fall victim to liberal kinds of thinking about race and gender, where they're like, difference can be somehow integrated into the way things are working. That obviously is liberal identity politics, which I hate. But there is a certain kind of authenticity working class politics that in some ways is also very counterproductive, where you're not dealing with the material reality of where we are, literally in the United States, like dealing with where working people are coming from, even how they interpret the world, like with the Floyd uprising. Yes, still we're going to have to end capital. But for a lot of people of color, African-American folks, in also working class areas, say in Philly, it wouldn't hurt to try to touch base with them and see why they're so frustrated. Firstly, about police brutality. It's not like, oh, you guys are just, you got to think about this instead. Like, there's still nothing. These are not meant to butt heads with each other. You're still like, there are material conditions here still happening from policing and other things that are going on too, based on race, based on gender. And these are things that need to be resolved for us to win the class war. That's what I'm trying to do with some of this writing. And that's something I've again gained from other people. I just want to reference, I think a lot more people need to talk to experts sometimes, like historians and people like that. I'm not trying to be like pretentious. I'm learning too. I would not have learned these things if I didn't read the books I mention constantly. Like, that's what I try to say. Like, I'm not inventing anything new. I'm just literally trying to like look at why we are where we are. And look, this person wrote this really interesting book, for example, about Latino folks in New York City and what they try to do with African-American folks in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Wouldn't hurt to talk to them, you know?
Yeah, I've had a lot of responses to that. You know, I'm a para-academic. I used to be an academic. I have an MFA. You know, I was going to go get a Ph.D. in curriculum development at one point in my life. I gave up all that. I kind of have an abject hatred of academia, but I will also say that there's a kind of self-protective attitude against, like, quote, academic leftism or academic Marxism, where I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it, but now you're not going to know stuff that you actually need to know, because whether we like it or not, we live in a society with a pretty heavy division of labor. Most people do not have the time to go and actually study this stuff objectively, and the people who do happen to mostly be academics. So if you are not going to deal with them at all, you are cutting yourself off from like the only source of historical information and ideas about systems and stuff that we're going to do. And as much as I love, another capital reading group, I mean, literally a bunch of people run one in my Discord, but I point out to people that, like, that's not all we need to know. And if it was, like, the fact that, you know, for at least the past 10 years, I can like throw a rock and hit a capital reading group in a major city. Like, it's like, it's not, that's not it. Like, so I spend a lot of my time increasingly, I talk to historians of labor. I talk less to theorists than I used to. I will admit there's a tendency in the left media sphere to over-privilege philosophers. Yeah, you smile when I say that, Sudip. You probably also have noticed this, but because, you know, not that I'm against, like, well, I have my doubts about Lacanian psychoanalysis, but not that I think that has no place in what we're doing. But I'm like, why aren't more of us talking to labor historians? If you wanted to understand what's going on with China, why do you talk to different and maybe even opposed scholars of the Chinese left, including ones who read Mandarin? That would probably be helpful. And stuff like that. Not just streamers or frankly even people like me, because you got to check what I say, right? Yeah. And I guess this gets me to the second part of what I saw in your work. We've talked a lot about solidarity. We might come back to allyship, because I do want to get, that's a sticky wicket if there ever is one. But I want to talk about the role of the intellectual in this, because I guess I'm part of the PMC class, whatever the fuck that is. I would say that I am at minimum a labor aristocrat in a non-productive, socially necessary part of society, which is like a sentence to say what I do, but like I don't produce a commodity that adds to the general surplus fund. But capitalism can't function without what I do in some crucial way. Although maybe it can if things get really dark. But it is considered socially necessary. Marx talked about teachers as like some kind of as socially necessary, even if they weren't productive to surplus value. the reason why I bring that up though is because there is in some way in which this PMC, I like to call it the professional managerial strata, because then I'm talking about a social category and not a class, because I'm like, there's not a consistent actually relationship there to production for me to talk about as a class. But there is a way in which like educated workers from these specific areas will act in certain ways. Although, again, I think PMC is too broad. Like if I'm like looking at it really, I'm like, well, there's academics and there's professional managers and there's urban versus rural and on and on and on. But I say that because I feel like the intellectual on the left is both privileged and hated, like at the same time. So like most of us kind of are in some way, form, or capacity. If we're not academics, we're para-academics. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, it means that we are former academics and now do something else. A lot of us work in credentialed and protected fields like teaching or nursing. And right now, like the more radical unions tend to be in credentialed and protected fields. And the reason for that is it's harder to strike for us, so we can be a little bit more aggressive. And then you know, we were talking about this whole imaginary 50s industrial worker that people have, but there is also this imaginary intellectual,
right,
that people have, whom they both somehow associate with leftism, feel like we are all one of, but also we should hate them, and they have no purpose to play in the larger role. And, you know, Lenin said some mean things about the intellectua, although what he meant by that was a specific class of people in the in the Russian Empire who were literal hierons and being patronized by the crown.
Same for Marx. I mean, that's why he was talking about in the German idiot, like he's going after certain intellectuals who really love the state and
right,
think,
yeah,
like
because they literally work for it,
right? So,
like, and yeah, there is a way in which I do think I think there is an unfortunate truth to the fact that a lot of people have socialism is when the state does things views, because they work for the state even now. But I do worry about how that pivots into an anti-intellectualism or an unwillingness to engage with like just basic fucking facts. Like, so what do you think about the role of the intellectual in the current left? Because I think this is becoming, I think one of the things this PMC debate is about is a backdoor fight about this.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, like you mentioned reading this, but I wrote a piece about understanding, or at least writing about this kind of dilemma about how we should see left intellectualism, what its worth is, what its limits are, for the Brooklyn Rare recently. And again, like with a lot of my other pieces, I chose to not just write about myself. I interviewed friends of mine because I also wanted to show that even how we think about the intellectual, who they are, like you mentioned, isn't really like the guy with the pipe smoking a pipe, you know, it's not Adorno, you know, anymore, really, like, you know, calling the police on his students. It's my friends who are having a tough time getting into the tenure track, but nonetheless, you know, yeah, certainly still being sort of privileged in some other ways, right? It is very like, so there are a lot of things about being an academic that definitely annoys me and annoys my friends. You know, there's certainly, even if you're not being paid well, you can still be part of a bubble, right? You can still be part of a cultish way of thinking. Even if you think you're being, you know, well-spirited, you can still think about politics without thinking about power, for example. You can call yourself a Foucauldian on, and, you know, all those different things.
But also be a liberal somehow, which is, It's like you read Discipline and Punishment as like not a critique, but like as a user's manual or something.
Well, I mean, it makes sense if you think about some catch-all terms, right? I think this is also the problem with the fact that we're talking about academia still recovering from the Cold War, right? You don't have a lot of, you know, actual commies and Marxists who think about these things structurally. So you are left with these other signifiers. And so people kind of pick them up. I'm saying this in a good faith way. I think people generally they want to be radical and left or liberal, but what they have to pick from is very, very restricted still. Like, it's like you become a Foucauldian, not a communist. You become somebody who is a liberal, really, but thinking you are leftist because you use decentralized or everything's local over and over again. And if if someone like me mentions, what about national politics, or what about, and this is also me, I was a little bit, for like a hot minute, like for a month or two, like, this is kind of interesting, but then also getting really bored because I was like, wait, what happened to national politics? But still, I think the issue is just the ramifications of the Cold War and repression, and people kind of, losing that kind of intellectual tradition, ironically, from academia. But the other issue about the role of the intellectual is, I think there is a critique to be made again about the quote unquote intellect, which I just said. But I think the issue becomes really dangerous, even, like you said, becoming anti-intellectual, when you blame the so-called academic for the failures of the left. I think academia reflects broader patterns in society. Like, it wasn't like professors who were liberal or conservative who then led the movement for neoliberalism. Like, it was vice versa. It was a neoliberal intellect along with their billionaire bosses and such who were like, hey, we can use each other for different things, who then made it very impossible for universities to have Marxists or openly Marxist people. It's not a person like me who's the reason why the left can't get their shit together. But there are intellectuals who can make it harder, but it's kind of like top backwards, or ass backwards, and how it's sometimes revealed.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the Cold War is that in the weirdness of the left's relationship to the universities. Yeah. I've written histories on, I'm literally writing a book on Christopher Lasch off and on for the past 2.5 years, and he's writing during this time period and talking about this, as he's in an academy, by the way. So like he's a professor, during this time period. But he points out that, like, okay, so the original thought, and this should be read in context. I'm gonna start throwing out some scholars for people to read. This is not a leftist, but the scholar Louis Menand's book on the American University is actually incredibly useful for this. Is you had this confluence of a bunch of people who came, we forget, that originally came from the working class, that moved up into the universities through the GI Bill, and then a lot of investment from the capitalist government into public education that turned it from kind of a very small training facility for very specific legal and ecclesiastical professions into a near universal training facility for a bunch of different things: professionals, managers, certain kinds of skilled labor, and in the entirety of the 20th century. And I'm going to drop another book. David Blacker in The Declining Grade of Learning talks about this. And he's a Marxist, so at least drop one Marxist in here. You also see this push from policymakers to expand schooling because it kind of lowers the unemployment rate. And so all this happens together. What I learned from the Christopher Lasch part is the left's association with the academy was a deliberate strategy to kind of go in, deal. I mean, in Ehrenreich's first book, Barbara and John Ehrenreich's first book on the PMC is actually by this: go in, get this kind of these new educated, whether you think they're workers or not is a different question, but student group, a lot of whom have not yet been able to take roles in society, and radicalize them. And so that led to the Long March into the universities. I mean, and you see this with a lot of the Panther women, like Angela Davis, etc. There is a truth, though, that sociologically speaking, college has historically been a conservatizing force. Now, I say a conservatizing and not a conservative force because it isn't a conservative force at all. But it is a very institutional. I mean, it's a medieval institution. It's kind of slightly updated for the capitalist world. That's what it is. And so there is a way in which you will see, for example, like fairly hegemonic center liberal, neoliberal politics, even amongst people who seem like they're very radical. I mean, you think of someone like Judith Butler on cultural issues or something, And then when you look at their electoral politics, you're like, that makes no sense. And then you realize, like, oh no, that's kind of the effect of this institution. However, what I think you're right about is the institution itself actually didn't cause that. It is a specific role that it has played as a trainer of a certain subclass of people, that has this kind of knock-on effect that people have kind of gamified, but it is not something that that inherently, like, that the intellect, like, no Marxist went in and thought, no matter how Frankfurt School influenced they were, that they were going to go in, take over the universities, educate everybody, and just, we'll just policy fiddle our way to communism through educating all the new students. Nobody thought that. That's never, no one's argued it. You can't find any evidence for it. The people who say that are usually pushing basically revived form of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theories, like
and also just it also doesn't, but it doesn't also get rid of the fact, again, of academia as how it operates, maybe, versus academia as what it could be. So, like, in how I describe it, I accept the fact, like, I do get annoyed when people have that view. I mean, even if it's not what Marxist intended, there's certainly people, I feel like, who think, like, speaking truth to power. Like, if I'm an academic or I can publish a certain amount of books or get people to learn, it's going to be that important step. Now, people are going to learn some things, but I don't think that's the role. At least that's not my role. I do view myself as an intellect, as somebody who's learning, as an academic, so I'm accepting that. But I don't think, everyone's waiting with bated breath about the next article I'm going to write or the next book to be like, oh shit, yeah, capitalism does suck, or like, this is really bad. Like, I didn't know that, Steve. Like, what are you talking about? So that's what I'm not saying. That does annoy me. But the other reverse of it is then to discount, like, Marx was an academic. Like, that's what I'm so weird, like, confused about. It's like learning.
Marx was an academic patronized by a manager, like, whose father was a bourgeoisie. Like,
and you mentioned the BPP. Like, I want to highlight Donna Murch. She's a historian at Rutgers, and she wrote "Living for the City," and she spoke at our chapter. So we try to have people like that come through. And she said, like, a lot of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party in Oakland met on college campuses. Because it was still opening the door to think about things you need to think about that you won't have time to think about unless you're in certain spaces, like, just pure and simple. Like, my parents, they're both educated, but, everybody in my community growing up in Queens, for example, they never were like, City, don't go to school or don't go to college. They were like, really just, they wanted me to go to college because they knew I'd be exposed to things that they wouldn't be exposed to. And then I could come back or something. Now, whether I feel like that's my capacity, that's not. I definitely feel like, I want to tell them the truth. Like, hey, listen, that's not the plan for me. But it's a little confusing to me when people do that weird sort of, again, like there's nothing valuable in learning. Like, learning itself has literally been a foundational thing to all the people we've been reading. The people have been kind of like, having pitted against each other. Again, there is an academic who exists, who is very much immersed in doublespeak and rhetoric. But then there's the academic who understands what academia could be. And like you said about the Bolshevism, the anti-Semitism talk, the weird sort of, that's a weird vibe. Like, I do get worried, even if it's a left person speaking so much about intellectuals being the bane of all existence, where I'm just like, listen, whether you know it or not, this is heading down a very weird road that I think is problematic on many fronts, because eventually, to me, it'll always lead that way. Eventually you'll find these same people, just like with some trots became extremists in other ways, you'll find this weird frustration.
Or like the ultra leftist in the Italian Socialist Party, who literally were the leadership of the fascist. Literally, that's where they came from. So I mean, this is a whole different topic, but that's actually important when I talk about, like, okay, yes, we can talk about fascism as like a degraded defense mechanism of liberal capitalism. Yes, we can talk about fascism as like a revanchist, almost aristocratic response to everything, and those things are actually both true. But there's also an element. The leadership of fascists were pissed off leftists who, like, tailed the right and ended up or took weird actually in the case of Mussolini, he specifically took a weird accelerationist position in regards to the end of the Italian Empire, and then during the war flipped, possibly partially because of the trauma induced in the war, to defend the Italian state, and that was the beginning of his leadership role down the fascist road. I bring this up not because like I'm also tired of fast spotting and fast jacketing amongst the left. It gets real old.
What's that?
Looking for everyone to be a secret Strasserite or whatever. Like they're all those tendencies are actually real.
Yeah,
but like you know what I mean when you start seeing like everybody. You know, you start calling everybody and their dog a fascist because they might have one. But the point that I'm getting to here, though, is that one of the things that I think about that any kind of intellectual with any kind of training on the left has a kind of moral responsibility to do, and I don't normally talk moral things, and this is for systemic reasons, but I don't really know how to talk about how you propel people to do this. Is the capitalization and privatization of the general intellect was not something, I will say, Mike McNair writes about this, it's not something that Marx really foresaw. And that has happened. And so we have a duty to take some of the more useful skills we have, and so much that some of them are useful, and disseminate them to a broader public. That's our fucking role. Like when people ask me, like, why aren't you salting for Amazon? And I'm like, well, one, like, I'm not, like, it's not in my immediate interest to quit my job that pays better and go salt for Amazon. And for two, and you could say, well, that's self-serving, but I also think, like, yeah, but salting really should kind of come from people who really would have skin in the game anyway. But two, and I think more importantly, it's also not my skill set. Whether I like it or not, I was trained as an academic and an artist. That's what I can give. I'm good at analysis. I can give that, and I can make it accessible to people without formal educations. And that's what I should be doing. And we can very much fault a whole generation of academic Marxists for not doing that. And I think that's a real critique. Like no one's like, I mean, as much as I like, why do people read Mark Fisher, not Frederick Jameson? Right? Because Mark Fisher took all the Frederick Jameson ideas and put in like a 90-page book. That like almost anybody with a high school education can read.
Well, pop culture references are important. All those kind of things.
Yeah. As much as the pop culture stuff annoys me personally, and that's the one area where I start sounding like Adorno, and I was like, you don't have to watch shit TV. No one has to. But I do think it is important to take this and meet people where they're at. And I think that's true with just skills in general. Like, how many people would benefit from an understanding of the various kinds of macroeconomic theories and debates and evidence that we have as a worker, so that they are at least have an intellectual self-defense against like politicians throwing bullshit at them about like austerity and or about how we don't have stuff to pay for things, or because it's just a lie. I'm not a modern monetary theorist, but they're right about that. So like or they'll try, or when and this is another important one, when activists try to like do national level policies in a place like California without realizing that like California can't print its own money, it has to tax for that. So there actually is a completely different limitation on that than there would be at the national level. And if you don't understand that, like, for example, like when there's this big push for like national state level socialized medicine in California, and I'm like, well, I mean, California's rich enough, they might be able to do it, but they're going to have constraints that a national government would never have. And if you don't see that difference, you are going to advocate for bad policy. And the one thing I will say another thing I got from Marx is you don't ever advocate for policy you don't think would actually work, because then the workers will never fucking trust you again.
I was gonna, like, there's a limited amount of patience people can have with certain politics. It's already an issue with DSA where people are fatigued and frustrated and have kind of pulled away. So even for those people who are explicit socialists, it can impact them. But the thing I wrote down that you also said that was something I highlighted in the piece, and I think is what I was trying to get to, but you just said, like, academia can produce the most annoying type of people. But academia can also give you skills to be very useful for other people who just don't have that space. And I'm also not saying people who don't go to college. I'm saying social science, humanity. There are a lot of things that these kind of fields can offer people that are very, very needed. And it, like, so for example, I help run the Paul Ed side of things in our chapter still. And I've been a little bit like taking some time figuring out what to do, because the last couple of months have been very like just overwhelmed with other work. But usually when I think about Paul Ed, I am thinking about it in a way I would think about my classroom. Like, there are certain things I know people need to know to put the pieces together. Like, for example, you're talking about California. It brings up a discussion we had in our chapter about federalism, U.S. federalism.
Major problem.
Major problem, because like you said, it can also, so for a lot of people in our chapter, people are like obviously down to confront and challenge people, actually. But it is, learning about these things also lets you not waste your energy, right? Like, so obviously with federalism, you learn a certain thing about how things actually work and why you need state level coordination, why you need these things, because it's not just like you failing, it's literally how our government is sustained. So it explains why maybe some things aren't working the way you thought. So it could maybe hopefully keep you engaged. And then there's other discussions we've had, like neoliberalism. We've had to like define it because, it is a different kind of capitalism. It explains a little bit again about where we are, why certain things aren't working. And again, that clarity is not meant to say, therefore, you're now just like your mind has a third eye and you're seeing things. It's more like it's keeping you rooted, grounded, and it's not letting you get overwhelmed. Because I feel that's another obstacle for people, is getting very overwhelmed. There's so many things suck. You don't always know how things are working. And once you understand how they work, they're a little bit more demystified. And I think that's one of the things academics or intellectual types can actually do for people. It's help demystify what they're up against. And that just is very important, regardless of how somebody feels about a certain program or university or person. Because same thing with Donna Murch. Like, when she came through and talked about the Black Panther Party, I mean, I'm a huge fan. I'm like obsessed with them. But I didn't really think about the beginning of what they did, meeting on college campuses. I wasn't fully aware about certain parts of their politics. It created such an interest in me to go forward, but also just made me feel very rooted to some kind of tradition as well. And she's a historian, she's a professor, but the reason why she's so valuable is because the stuff she's researching is valuable, but also she broke it down very effectively. Again, it's not the knowledge, it's like you said, it's how you disseminate it. So I feel like there are people who have the time to accrue that knowledge and skill, and it's useful. Like, I'm just worried because sometimes I think you mentioned this in another episode, but there's a lot of haze and post-Bernie kind of malaise that's happened. And I am worried that this malaise can kind of be used by certain frustrated, cynical types to either get people to be more cynical or to hate the wrong kind of things. Just because it might be like I think you mentioned in the last episode, you mentioned like this tendency to have Bonapartist politics, or the tendency to like want to have a cheat code. Oh, it's not our national bourgeoisie, it's another national bourgeoisie. I want to avoid that. And so I think actually the intellect can help try to avoid that struggle. And one last thing about that is like the organic intellectual type, like what Gramsci talked about. There are certain intellects who need to be the springboard for certain ideas, period, because they're going to go up against other intellects, frankly, especially in times of chaos like right now. Like, there's so many moving parts. Like you mentioned patriotic socialism or something. I can't even tell you, like, I don't even know what like I try to stay away actually from a lot of this stuff, ironically, but I saw a debate between some people about it, and I was just like so confused over how this got any kind of following. And I was like, this is why you need people who know some stuff about certain things to actually push back, or at least give somebody different kinds of readings or people to look toward.
Right. I mean, I think that's hugely important. I realized that when I started realizing how woefully ignorant the American left was when it started talking about left-wing politics in other countries outside of Europe. They actually do tend to kind of know.
Yeah.
I mean, like, there is a real Eurocentrism there. And I actually sometimes laugh at the Eurocentrism because I'm like, you guys are more Eurocentric when Europe's actually like less relevant.
Right.
But regardless, you know, I'm not here to like wag my finger at people paying attention to Europe. My larger point is, like, sometimes I hear people say, well, the left is just better in other places, and I'm like, is it? Do you know? Like, I mean, I know you've heard about Norway and Sweden, but do you know what actually do you know their history? And
right.
So, like, and then I realized, like, fuck, I don't know all their history.
Right.
So, like, you know, and I also noticed about this in Latin America. Like, people would ask me, because I kind of am a little bit of a specialist on Mexico. But then they'd ask me to come and talk about Latin America, and I'm like, I don't know shit about anything south of Colombia. Like, I mean, I'm just gonna be honest with you.
Yeah.
Like, I know a little bit about how the current Venezuelan government works, and like, and you know, I know the basic political parties in South and Central America. But like, if you like, well, how did this? I'm like, I don't know. Just because I know the history of one Spanish-speaking American country very well doesn't mean that I'm like the expert who can talk to you about Peru. And then I was like, oh, like, expertise really does matter. And people often think that I'm being credentialist, and I'm like, no, I don't only talk to academics. Like, I also talk to people from the region, and put them on the show even. The credential isn't the important thing. The expertise is, and you can get expertise in a number of ways. But let's be honest, if you're working all the fucking time and then you don't have the mental energy when you get home and you just play video games, you aren't going to have the capacity to have developed a whole lot of different expertises on your own. I mean, and that is, and I would even like to encourage this among intellectuals, because one of the pernicious things about the university is that, because of, I actually think that, you know, I talk about this in terms, not even in Marxist terms, this is a problem of overcomplexity, but because of the amount of different kinds of technical skills that we have, that academics also are now often just as bad about anything not in their specialty as like non-academics are about. And so I'm like, we also need to educate each other, because like, I can tell you, as a person educated in the humanities who used to be forced to think about Derrida and Foucault all the time, when I actually learned what systems theory really was, it was a fucking revelation. And I wish the goddamn engineer had sat me down and explained it to me years ago. And yet, because of the structure of the university, even when talk about interdisciplinary classes or whatever, that never happened. Like, and it's one of those concepts that's like both revelatory and actually not super hard. And it seems hard. It seems like, oh, cybernetics, super scary. Actually, no, it's really not. You don't actually need to understand high level math to get the basics of this. And I think, you know, although I would say just socialist also teaching some people some fucking math would be, no one likes to do that, but it would actually help. And stuff like that. I do think that's our role. And I don't think that, like, our role, like, I used to think about this when Lenin talked about the Vanguard Party, and, you know, there are problems with this because of the real history of the USSR, but I do want to point out that its initial function from Kautsky through to Lenin, this is something that is continuous between them, that there is no break, is that the initial function of the Vanguard Party is organizational and educational. It's not even totally political. And like, but you can't do the politics without it. Like, and that is, you know, that is something that we just have to admit. Like, like people pull from what's immediately available to them. And like if you're in the rural South, for example, and you're a worker, like most of the stuff you got's going to be like church based or like some, you know, what's on the national news, probably Fox. But even if you're a little bit more progressive, CNN, that's what you're going to get. Like,
well, same here in New Jersey. Like,
true, actually.
Right, and that's what I'm saying about the initial point, the countervailing force. Like, I still think all this is material. Like, it's not a sense of like people choosing to be brainwashed or choosing to think a certain thing, right? But it's all material. It's just a lack of a countervailing force, which includes people who are, I think that's a good way of saying it, experts, willing to take the time to learn something, to share that with others. Like, again, in my group of friends, I've seen them shift over time. And I'm not saying it's just me. Like, literally life is getting harder for us. So you kind of like, wow, this really sucks. But there are like friends of mine who legitimately, I think in the last 2-3 years, who have asked me questions about things. And I think the most stupid thing to have done was to be like, hey, don't ask me anything. Just, you know, figure it out. Like they were looking for something.
Oh yeah, that tactic.
Right. So I'm just saying they were looking for something. I have friends and family who will, family will like, you know, like typical, you know, aunts and uncles and stuff will ask you a question and then just move on to another topic. But like some family, they ask me questions about what I'm learning, and then I tell them what's going on, and they're just like, huh. And that's, you know, that's what they're looking for. Like, I'm just amazed when people say things like, and it's funny because like you mentioned the niche politics too. Like within academia, it's not like, again, I'm not trying to say everybody in academia is just waiting to share what they know. I'm saying that there are people in academia who are still useful enough, and academia could be useful enough to do that thing. It's more of an ideal too, right? Because like, academia right now is also very much like in political science, like which I write about, there is very much an incentive to not read too much, actually, ironically. That you just stay within a certain niche.
Right, yeah.
And then you refer to 5 people, and then those 5 people will refer to you, and then you refer back to them in your next article, and it creates a loop. So the interdisciplinary stuff of what we think of the academic, ironically, is not reinforced. So there is that contradiction as well, but that's within academia. I just think that people kind of have a tendency, certain people, of flattening academia also as not being rife with these contradictions and tensions, where you have academics who definitely fit the annoying type, but then you have academics who are literally trying, but are also incentivized to go to a certain conference because they need a job. And therefore they may have to speak in a certain way to be listened to or to be seen as smart. Right. I've seen that firsthand for myself. I've seen it where, and I'm a Marxist, and I am very lucky. My advisors are amazing. Rutgers is really cool, but there are definitely conferences where I've heard people and I've thought, you know what? I'm not going to say anything because this is just going to stop the conversation dead on, and it's going to be awkward. And these people read a lot, but clearly they read like about voting theory. They've read about voting and things like that. And so, but it doesn't besmirch the idea of academia, is what I'm saying. It doesn't get rid of the value. It just says that there's certain people in it because of how it's structured, you know? And That's what I think you kind of referenced earlier. It's not institutionally like, the way the institution works is a problem, but in its ideal state, it's something very much needed. And with the Vanguard politics of it, you know, it's really funny too. Like, since my parents come from West Bengal and my dad, I don't think he read Lenin as much, but he loved Lenin because you know, the whole, like, he was the first one to actually invite Indians. So that's the funny thing. Like, yeah, you're right. You don't need to read something to also know the value of it. He's, in my view, much more appreciative and actually learned than some leftists who are maybe anti-Leninist for some bizarre reason. But still, he would, I think, when I talk to him about what I've learned and read about Vanguard this or that, it's still something he's interested in. Like, you know, there's all these different kind of complexities to how people really are beyond our little discussion groups that still calls for expertise or somebody to have a discussion about certain things, you know, like, so even with the Vanguard stuff, like, when I read more about Lenin too, beyond my dad's fandom, I'm like, okay, this is complicated, but I can see what he was actually trying to say, like you mentioned. And I do agree, there's still education. Like, I'm just really confused where people think that people have the time or have the wherewithal constantly to just like that realize how things work. Like that would, because if there's no, then it kind of also assumes that working people are ignorant constantly or choosing their oppression, because there aren't, like that's the loop I don't get. It's like you're kind of implying then that they're choosing oppression. What I'm saying is no, the conditions are just there, but the organizational capacity is not there, and people are kind of like socialized to think of their certain way, all those other reasons, not because they're choosing to be oppressed or something strange.
Right. You end up with the choosing to be oppressed, so you end up with the, well, they just adopted the wrong ideology and that explains everything. That's another maddening one that's like ridiculous. It's like, no, this is not a matter of just like, I learned the true faith and now I see the truth. That's not what this is about. And like, the other thing I do think that we as Marxists need to like step up on, and I like your work because you talk about it, and you even shows up and you like you're self-humbling about the support roles and stuff like that, is to actually look at what our incentives are. Like, one of the things that I got frustrated with the other day is I was like, well, the guys want me to debate because most of you are para-academics, and like, when you, I mean, to use the cliche metaphor, but it is one that's apt here, when all you have is a hammer, you think everything needs a nail, and you forgot that you didn't, and my addition is you forgot that you didn't even have lumber. Like we aren't at that stage, or maybe it's something that we need to do, but we are over investing in this one element of it. Another one, and I'm going to wag my finger at the DSA a little bit, is this. I'm not canvassing for someone right now. So, and the reason why is because I don't think the conditions for even if they were the best, electoral socialist politician, that I don't think we've built the conditions of which they could succeed. Like every incentive socially is not there yet. And so I think you're kind of putting a lot of effort and a work that really, if we needed to do some prior work first, it's not even that, the socialists shouldn't canvass. That's dumb. It's more that like, the classic, the old line. It's a line that's been dropped since 2016, but I do remember hearing it from when I was in high school through my reactionary phase into leftism, as like, well, voting is stupid. And I'm like, on one hand, I'm like, yeah, if you think you're going to vote socialism in the power and that, that is dumb. But if you don't vote your strategic interest, you are literally giving up one of the few tiny and very, and admittedly, almost not mathematically significant, but still levers that you do have for nothing. Like, you're replacing it with nothing at all. So it's like, when people say, like, when I go off on electoral politics, or I was like, socialists have to go it alone, which is something I do say a lot. I am not saying that you like just let whoever win whatever fucking election. I'm saying you need to prioritize your energy in a very particular way, of which that is actually kind of lower. But it also, frankly, doesn't require much energy to vote either. So I think that, we see that right now in a lot of socialist groups. It's not just the DSA. It's I mean, like, how much resources does SALT put into keeping Khassama Sawat, and I like Khassama Sawat, actually. I really, truly do. Yeah. But like, okay, now you're already in a loop now where we're literally protecting one city council person in a major city. So that's not important. But like, that's where most of your resources go every 2 years. So it's like, when do we think about what we'd have to build up so we wouldn't have to spend so much energy on just that? Yeah, like, that's the important distinction, right? And I think your point about solidarity, having to have some kind of programmatic goal to actually hold it, and a set of like similar orientations. I'm not a person who believes that socialists, it would be advisable, and this actually is a problem I have with the Bolshevik strategy, is banning factions and having absolute consensus on action is smart. I think that's actually, it's absurdly dangerous to do that. Right. For the reasons that we talked about in the beginning, there are also legit interest conflicts that people are going to have that we have to work out. And if we just pretend that we can consensus over that, we'll never work it out.
The key thing is working them out for the sake of coming to some consensus on certain things eventually. So I think the one thing about the DSA that I think some critics are right about, frankly, is the fact that there's two different extremes here. There's the one extreme where you just mentioned that you can sometimes just say we just don't need to talk about certain things, and somehow they'll just work out in the shadows or something, which never works. But the other problem is just like we'll never try for some kind of consensus. We'll never try for some kind of vision because it's not that important when it is. I mean, this is what holds people together, especially through crisis moments like now. This is what's happening, is that people are looking for some kind of goal in mind. And, that was Bernie for some moments. And that's why I think you're seeing a little bit of like frustration now from some people and fatigue, because now that's gone. That option is gone. And I think it's gone. And so now you're just like left with what else? Because there was no other conversations. Like there had to be other conversations about that not working out. And and you said like the pre-gaming part too. Like, so I actually get annoyed with certain critiques of the DSA only because certain critiques can also come off as just like super, super flattening too. So some people on the DSA, they definitely, again, do that kind of work of just like weirdly avoiding things we need to discuss. Like just everything is decentralized, all these local groups are just going to, work it out. And occasionally there's a national thing for PRO-ACT or something, which I called for, but still it's like very random sometimes. But then there's like these critiques that come out like, oh, DSA is all about electoralism and that's the enemy and whatever. When whether it's non-electoral or electoral, it doesn't matter. The main thing is if you're building, like, this is something I reference in my work a lot, like if you're building an independent constituency, like a mass base that really is understanding what its role is beyond electoralism and even beyond just organizing on some issues. If you're actually also having people understand, like you said, electoralism is not going to win socialism. But yes, you can vote strategically because there's some issues that you need to have worked out, right? So having this more nuanced view about building power and using these things as tool, I think sometimes goes missing too. I think there's a tendency to have different camps on that end. Like some people saying, I'm an electoral person, this is the only way. And some people saying everything electoral is bad. When I'm just like, at our chapter, by the way, we've never endorsed anyone. But we're not anti-electoral, we just don't endorse. I vote, but I just didn't see any candidates who were interesting, frankly. There were certain people who I think wanted to be endorsed by us, and I was like, not just me, but a few of us were like, if this person takes the DSA label, it's not good. Like, we don't want that. But it's not because we had this vision about anti-electoralism. We were just being very strategic about other things we need to have happen, like building a mass base, building like relationships with groups that do exist. Like you mentioned, the white activists being very shocked, I guess, by certain people in the undocumented community not necessarily also connecting for other reasons. We're also not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're not trying to be like, we don't need any coalitional partners, because we have coalitional partners with groups who do those work in those areas, and we work with them. So those are the things that we need to, but that's assessment. That, I guess I'm saying, like, it's not like people need to assess what's going on. That people need to really take time to learn what's happening in their neighborhood and the broader forces. I think people sometimes have a tendency to just
do one or the other.
One or the other. Right. That's what I was going to say. And it's very baffling to me, because even for somebody who is in academia, and I think I benefited from not going straight into it, like working as a full-time reporter for a while and being frustrated about that too, because some of this I just don't understand why like certain conversations even happen. I'm just like, why? What is the conflict here? It just seems this isn't the conflict I would have on this issue. Even with debating, for example, I do listen to debates occasionally when I'm doing other things, because it's nice to have in the background or whatever and learn some interesting things. I still think it's important, but I also think it's not, like you said, it's not the thing. Like same with intellectualism, what we're doing here is important, but it's not the core. Like, we're not going to win with you and me agreeing on something. It's going to be,
the podcast isn't going to change the world. Like
I would like it, but I mean, I would love
awesome, but
yeah, it can be amazing. Like I just put it on, and someone like it's like a weird like sci-fi movie where their eyes start glowing, and there's like I feel the Vanguard energy, and just go off into the streets like, organizing. But that's not going to happen, and I think I get really confused when people kind of imply this is the main thing rather than being a little humble and just saying, "Hey, this is just my supporting role to this bigger effort." And that's what you said with your skill set. Like I'm being honest, I have a lot of health issues, and it's one of the reasons why I had to step back from canvassing. If you told me 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that I wouldn't be knocking on doors still, I really love doing it because it also enhanced my writing and my analysis. I would be like, what do you mean? Oh, there's a pandemic and I don't want to get sick or anything. So I have to reassess what I can do, you know, but there's still a role. Like, that's what I mean. Like, people shouldn't think of it, oh, I'm not doing this thing, therefore I can't do anything. So I'm not saying don't debate. It's just that you have to do some other thing for people to remember this is not the thing. You can't just watch a 2-hour debate and think, this is it for my day, you know, I'm just going to move on from here. You need to still talk to your neighbor. You still need to talk about national politics, internationalism. And to your other point about left politics abroad, I agree. I actually think there's Eurocentrism, obviously, but I also think there's also a weird kind of lumping of all people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Oh yeah. Like
they're all just like there's no nationalisms competing. There's nothing like to worry about in the Badun conference when Singapore and the Pakistani military say like, hey, we're kind of down with nationalism, but not with communism. Like there's like obviously
or the Bandung conference like famously sets up a still going on tension between India and the kind of Fabian nationalist of the Congress Party and the communist in China, which has still never been resolved.
Right.
Like it's, you know, and to be fair, like, you know, outside of people from those areas, immigrants in the United States who are descendants of people from those areas, and frankly, Maoist and other kinds of decolonized weirdos,
or people who have some kind of party link. Because I'll say to your earlier point about how, like in the Indian American community, even when I was growing up in Queens and New Jersey, they also, like, having lived here now for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they've also developed very insular views about what India is like. Like one person said a Bengali person came to a conference here and was doing like a music or something. I think he said this or someone, but he was also, I think I read this maybe, he also was shocked at the community here who was still stuck in the 60s and 70s about what art looks like. Right, like because like things are moving, you know what I'm saying. So I think I'm you're right, but I don't think it's even just that. It's like particular connections to parties even that have to exist for people to be like, oh, but I don't even know if people in my family knew about. Like my dad, like it's funny, I bring him up, but he is not like, you know, he understands China's like invasion of the Northeast and things like that, but he's still kind of like fond of certain things because he doesn't know the nitty gritty of it, and he's part of the party. So I'm just saying, for other people, they have no idea still because they've been living here since the 70s, and they're just like, yeah, so, you know, Bollywood, some movie they'll reference or some kind of song or tradition as if it never changed. And they're shocked when they see like rap music and Bengali music from like maybe 30-year-olds are like, what happened? And it's like, well, life happens and people develop new interests.
Right. Well, like for example, my aunt was from Korea, and she came in the 70s, and she would tell me stories about Korea. And when I lived in Korea for several years in the aughts, it was like that didn't help at all. In fact, even the Korean language has changed since what you were speaking. So like you didn't prepare me for K-pop or the internet being faster here than God, or like or just, you know, and I'm like, yeah, because, you know, diaspora communities are often like frozen in the the time that they came over, and their cultural traditions in which they maintain as traditions often they're not invented exactly, but they are often like frozen in the exact moment in the exact time, which you don't experience in the place itself, and that's all. Yeah, I think that's huge, and with India, man, like. My experience with India personally is basically there isn't much of one, and I know a lot of Indian English-speaking artist from the literary community, actually,
Mhm.
and then I have a kind of conflicted relationship with Sinhalese Tamil ethno tensions because of the particular time in which my father, who was flirting with Buddhism and wanted me to be Buddhist, had me deal with the Theravadan community of refugees in the United States. So like, I also like, I'm like, okay, so I have this very narrow, hyper culturally specific Sri Lankan, South Indian, like range of knowledge to which I used to think applied to most of the country, and it absolutely does not. Like, and
But that goes
go
back
ahead.
to the solidarity issue of like just willing to adapt, willing to know you don't know everything, and you, like you said, you need to at least be in the community and really figure that stuff out, and also be willing to concede that these tensions are there and they're going to be there. Because I think there's also this solidarity is at the core of most of life, whether people know it or not. Like even the racial categories we take as not you and me, those are solidarity, like a very bizarre form, right? Whiteness is solidarity in that sense. Like it's a negation of the good for rest of society. But if you, like I tell my students this all the time, my students are mostly diverse, right? They're mostly people of color, but there are white students. And I always joke about how none of them come from Whitelandia. None of them came from a country that said white. They had, like, I have to tell them, like, think about an Irish person having to now identify with an English person here. That is insane to me when you think about the history of it. But then there was this term, this concept. You mentioned material incentives that happened, the conflicts that happened, the way it's shaped. And now, boom, people are like, even Italian Americans who were once discriminated, who are just now the ones wielding bats in Philly to defend Columbus statues. It's like, there's solidarity there. It's a bizarro Superman solidarity, but I'm just saying it's always there. It's just, the thing is that we have to think about is, of course, what terms we want it. As Marxist, obviously not that. As a person of color, obviously not that.
Yeah, clearly.
But for me, it's like, it's obviously there. It's just that, because I only bring that up because there's a tendency also sometimes to say things like, well, people are just not willing to.
No, they already have solidarity. Like genetically speaking, for example, if we really talk about like families, I'm related to people from the outskirts of the Celtic region of the British Isles, and I'm related to North Africans and Bulgarians. I don't have shit to do with the greater project of European greatness. I'm from the fucking periphery. Yet I am still white. And all my ancestors are not even European, I am still white because of the weird fluctuation and strange solidarity. And it's strange. And I point this out about the South. Latino immigrants, as long as they weren't super duper dark, when I was a kid, were more or less considered white.
Right.
In my specific part of the country.
Yeah.
Because it was a binary racial divide.
Right.
And in the 90s, that changed. So people also talk about whiteness expanding. It also contracts. But it's a weird, it is based on solidarity based on frankly, a super superficial feature.
Right.
Like that, and anyone who studies like genetic anthropology is like, there's 6 kinds of mitochondrial DNA, and everyone who's not from Africa only shares 2 of them. So the differences are
day-to-day level, right?
And so you just like, and you're like, morphology doesn't equal human morphology doesn't equal that much, but yet it has become this basis of a settler solidarity that absolutely shapes almost in the United States. It's very true that you can't understand a lot of U.S. history unless you understand the construction of these racial categories. You just can't.
Well, you can't, and you have to view like this as a coalitional politics, in a way. Like you can't I only bring this up because I just finished reading an abridged version of the German ideology. I can't read I have to, and I want to admit admit when you can't read something entirely, because it's making that, demystifying that, letting people know you can read and skim will also make them feel better about themselves reading something and be like, I'm lost, you know? So, because I've had friends say that to me, like, how do you read all this stuff? And I just admit to them, like, I didn't read all of it. Like, I just skipped like the 3 chapters that kept repeating things and I got really bored and I read something at the end of it. But he mentioned something where I think he was, again, Stirner or someone, he was like responding to how they said, like the way he was, like the way that Marx was critiquing him was not like communism creates society. It's like society is always there. Same thing with, you know, how people say there's a capitalism without the state. That's not, state intervention is always there at some level. So like accept that on the terms and then say this is a different version of that. Because I get frustrated like when some people are like, well, you know, I think of, you know, capital, like what creates a good governance is less government. And I'm like, all right, well, do you think then your private property needs to be protected or something? It scrambles it. And I think the same thing when you're talking about solidarity, both the negative and positive side. So the negative side is what we talked about, but there's also the positive element of like Black folks, right? African-American folks creating solidarity. Like, again, these categories are fiction. They are materialized through actual conditions, but it still takes a lot of work for some people to pull together some kind of force. And that's what we saw in civil rights struggle, right? It's not like poof, everybody was like, we're together on this. It took decades of building institutions, decades of building resources, and ironically, decades of building experts and organic. Like King was an organic intellectual. Like, I don't know how anyone can't look at him and see how he was so learned. Like, I read a book by I forgot The Origins of the Modern Civil Rights Movement. I think Professor Morris, I think his last name is, sociologist. And in it, he talks about King wasn't necessarily an organizer even. His main thing was to go to different congregations, explain to them, not just the local stuff, because it's Jim Crow, but explain to them what's going on, why this tactic is useful, and then raise money. And people were like, they trusted him because he could speak really well. He can disseminate that knowledge in such an interesting, amazing way, but because also he was a doctor and he also came from a family of preachers and he has that pedigree. So it's like this, so that's like another form of solidarity that had to be created. I'm just saying that because I think, again, there's a tendency to be super cynical right now. And for some people to say it's impossible. I'm like, no, it's happening. You just are taking some things as already granted. And I think you mentioned this, but if we're not organizing solidarity for our end, which we need to do, the void is going to be filled by other forces of like creating different other kinds of weird solidarities, if they can call it as such, based like religious ones. Like maybe it's not being a worker, it's being an evangelical. You know, that's what we saw in Latin America now with evangelical churches being able to pull people together and become base of support for Bolsonaro or something. Like something else is going to happen. And it doesn't have to take up everybody, but it has to it can mobilize a certain group to be so invested in each other. I mean, that has to be something that needs to be countered and can be. If we remember, it's always happening, if that makes sense. Like the wheels are always turning. It's not like you just plant a seed one day. You're always in society. It's like the Joker movie memes. Like, we live in a society. Yeah, duh. Like, you know what I mean? But it's so valuable to say that. Like, we live in a society. You're not living out, like, it's happening, whether you like it or not. Now you have to take that next step to go beyond what you're thinking or trying to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in it. We've been talking for about 2.5 hours, and I have really enjoyed our conversation today. I think this is actually super important, and I like to I like to remind people that, you know, for all of our criticisms of liberalism, that the initial instantiation of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, or liberty, equality, and solidarity is how I'm going to translate that. Is vital, even though each one of those things is both mystified and weird, and we have to kind of narrow them down in specific ways, including actually equality. But it is something that I think we need to reinvest. And I do think the one that no one talks about is actually super damn important. And that is the solidarity one. I do remember, I have 1,000 political differences with Jodi Dean. But her book Comrades is actually really good. All my political differences, all my theoretical differences. I mean, we had this really nasty fight once of several years ago about whether or not labor theory of value is still useful, which is really arcane to everybody else. And these are the kinds of things that I do understand why Marxist academics and sectarians have a bad reputation, because everyone's like, those people are about to kill each other over like what they think value means. And so I'm like, yeah, I get why that's off-putting. I'm not saying it's not important, but I get why that's off-putting. But I was thinking about I thought about comrades, and I'm like, yeah, I used to talk to Michael Brooks about this, and Michael Brooks and I actually had very different politics.
Yeah.
But Michael and I used to talk about this. I'm like, we need to help people to be better organizers by also being more disciplined, kinder, more responsive, more inclusive people. And I don't just mean this in a moral sense, because there are some ways in which these traits are not valued now because they're in material incentives for them not to be. So like we are actually doing, like by doing this, you're doing this countercultural thing. And the only other, frankly, the only other like parts of society that are doing this right now are like churches and military and sports clubs.
Yep.
Like, so like we have to have an answer to that, because I don't necessarily want everyone's pro-social socialization coming from churches, the military, and sports clubs. So
right.
I mean, maybe sports clubs are okay, but you get my point.
But that's the thing. Like I one of my advisors, she was talking to me, and she said, well, we both talked about how, again, if you're not speaking, someone else is. That's just pure. Like, and I'm not suggesting that, because in my mind, there's so many, like, so in my mind, I'm not suggesting, for example, that the Republican Party is going to be taking everybody on, because I'll be honest, like they're a white nationalist, nihilist party. Like a middle class person, an upper middle class person of color is not going to vote for that explicit brand of the National Party. Pure.
Yeah, but they may just not vote at all. So.
They may not vote at all, and they may vote though for a conservative Democrat. So that's where I see the danger too. Like the danger is not building the kind of cadre and power we need to destroy the right wing's kind of, version of society, but also to create something new. And that's where I think it's important to reconnect people as intellectuals too, to that history. Like it's not, I think you mentioned before, like there's a limit to history. Like we're not when someone thinks about 1917, I think you mentioned this, like obviously I'm not like saying we just make the Bolshevik party and we'll do this. Like it's obviously different conditions. But if you reconnect people to, say, the Viet Minh struggle, even if you're not leading a tunnel war against the American state, I don't know what to say, but it made me, when I dug deeper into it, it made me feel like a little bit like, okay, there are definitely things we can still do, or definitely things we could, remember to do when these people were really faced up against the French, the Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the other value of being a historian, a political theorist, or intellect, where you can reconnect people to this history, which is, like you mentioned with the hammer and hoe thing, where you're from, deliberately excised or just let dissolve because of other reasons, where people who used to know this stuff are just dying or are not in the spaces they need to be to disseminate that knowledge, right? Because like I know people in my background who are not against like the Vietnamese struggle for independence, but just didn't know the nitty gritty of it. Or even the civil rights movement. When we talk about it in our chapter, we talk about it as a like understanding what really led to it. And when people really understand it, they're like, oh wow, this took decades or took a little longer than we thought. It does energize you in a different way. And it also makes you willing to confront those other forces, and it clarifies to you how you should approach even the things we talk about in terms of problematic politics too. Like there's red lines that happen. How do these groups deal with them? And how do you also achieve that unity? So I think that's the other value of having this kind of history at your back, right?
Yeah, I think that is that's super important to think about, particularly as we deal with some of the way that we're gonna have to be reorganizing things and building solidarity between people. And I think my last note, and this truly is the last note, I'm becoming kind of famous for false endings these days, is you're not just right that other people are talking. Right now, I think we're about to be in a very I mean this both in the broader sense that people are reacting to a bunch of things, but also in the very specific sense that, like, in the intermediate future, because of the way things have played out with the Democrats, we are going to be in a very reactionary period for a little while. Now, the growth of the DSA actually comes out as a kind of back channel response to the beginnings of this reactionary period. But I think we are entering a much uglier period, and there's going to be a lot of pressures now because the prior reactionary period was a good economic time, and that ain't true anymore. So this stuff on solidarity is going to be vital, or we are sitting ducks. And I think that's super important. So on that note, I'm going to tell people, check out the show notes on this show, because I'm going to list the 2 articles that we referred to, as well as something to help your chapter's mutual aid group. There's a Venmo down there for you guys, and if you want to throw the mutual aid work some money, you can probably look up Sudip, and you can talk to them about what that money specifically goes to, so you can have some accountability on that. But yeah, I'm going to put that in the show notes, and check out your writing. And if you're in the New Jersey area, I'm sure your chapter does some interesting political education stuff, and usually those are open to the public. I have done political education work with the DSA, and I'm not a member, and I talk a lot of shit. So, because the DSA provides that forum to the public, it is sometimes useful to use. So even if you're not a member, and even if you're not interested in being a member, if you're in the New Jersey area, maybe check it out. All right. And so with that, thank you so much for coming on, and have a great day.
You too. Thanks so much.
All right.